Welcome, Dr. Reeves. Thanks for spending some time with us today to talk about your new book, Elements of Grading. Could you please tell us a little bit about Elements of Grading?
Well, I'd be happy to. I'm really pleased with this book, I must say, because although I've written about grading in the past, this is an attempt to help people not only improve grading practices, but have better conversations about grading. Therefore, we're not only talking about teachers using this to improve classroom practice, but administrators, policymakers, even board members, legislators, and especially parents and community members who are interested in grading. This is a way to bring people together in what I hope will be a constructive dialogue, as well as address some of the practical questions teachers have about saving time and still doing grading right.
How does this book differ from the other books you've written about grading practices, and why did you choose to go in that direction?
Well, I've written, and certainly many other thoughtful scholars have as well. Canadian Ken O'Connor, Tom Guskey in particular have written very thoughtfully about how to improve grading practice. But what all of us have noticed is that grading has become an incredibly contentious subject. It's emotional. It draws the attention of boards and legislators and people who are just upset with public education generally, and grading becomes the focus of their anger. As a result, we not only need a book about how to improve practice, but also how to have a dialogue that meets the needs of teachers and parents and community members and policymakers, all of whom I think, for the most part, are well-intentioned, but sometimes have dramatically different views on grading. This is a way of helping people to reason together with a focus on improved student learning.
How is the book structured to benefit educators, and who is your target audience?
Well, the structure of the book follows four fundamental elements, and that is what we've called the elements of grading. They've got to be accurate, they've got to be specific, they've got to be timely. You know, it seems to me that of all the things that we talk about when it comes to importance of grading, and by the way, fairness is the fourth element. They've got to be accurate, fair, specific, and timely. It's not enough just to use those as platitudes. We've got to tell people how to do it. In fact, part of what I've done is to include reproducible handouts at the end so people can do a self-assessment. Too often, if you suggested that somebody was inaccurate or unfair, it's as if we're impugning their integrity. That's not at all the point of this book. The point is that all of us, including me as a teacher, can have inaccuracies creep in when we're not sufficiently specific about how we give feedback to students. We can have unfairness creep in when elements beyond the proficiency of our students creep into our grading system. So it's really not about saying one person's good and another is bad. Rather, it's about saying how can all of us improve our professional practice and continually assess our practice to make things better. It's especially important that we do so on grading because we know that feedback is one of the most powerful influences on student achievement. With respect to the target audience, I'd have to tell you it's much broader than I thought it was. Even the early emails that I'm getting on this come not only from teachers and administrators, but from people on school boards, policymakers at state and provincial levels. I think you will see this discussion get a lot of attention because grading is discussed at the highest policy circles at state, provincial, and national levels.
What is the best way for an educator to use this book?
Well, usually it starts with a book study where people can throw ideas up against each other, but I recommend against everybody saying we're going to make an immediate change and everybody's going to do it this way. I've seen policies be announced that then get undermined in actual practice. A far better way is action research, and that's where after reviewing the elements of grading in a study, you might have a half a dozen teachers who say, we're willing to volunteer for an action research project. Let's try it. Maybe Doug's right, maybe he's wrong, but let's give it a shot. What would happen if we tried things like his menu system? Would we have better homework compliance? What would happen if we changed our consequences for missing work from zeros and Fs to alternative consequences, including getting work done? Let's see if we have better work. Let's see if we have fewer failures, better discipline, higher achievement, more students eligible for advanced classes. And after 3 or 4 months, those half a dozen action researchers come back and report to their colleagues what happens. My evidence suggests that the #1 influence on the professional practice of teachers isn't a speech or a book from me. It's direct modeling by their colleagues. So start with group study, then action research, then report on impact. That's the best way to have long-term sustainable results.
If an educator is committed to improving his or her grading practices, what advice would you give that person to get started?
Pick one or two things that you know that you want to improve. You don't have to turn the whole thing upside down. You don't have to completely wipe out your report card. In fact, one of the things that I advise people to is think about what is not going to change. In other words, before the rumor gets going that you're changing grading practices, think about what won't change. What are the relationships you have with students and parents in terms of how you reward them for great work and how you recognize outstanding practice and how you engage them even beyond grading. Think about what's not going to change. And then think about how, with your improved practice, perhaps you're going to give additional feedback to students and parents. Perhaps you'll create a menu system that engages students in exercising some choice on homework and on assessments. Think about how you're going to add value in terms of interest and engagement. So don't just announce the policy. Think about how you're going to make things better for students and make sure you communicate with parents as well. I also think it's a good idea to have some real clear benchmarks. You know, for example, what your failure rate was for this class a year ago. Now set that as a baseline and see if you can improve that. You know what your homework completion rate was a year ago and your assessment success rate was a year ago. Set that as a benchmark and say, can I improve that with improved grading and feedback practices?
You address 4 specific criteria for evaluating grading. Can you tell us a little bit about your criteria and how you came to define them?
Sure. It's easy to come up with laundry lists of all the different things that we ought to do. And I'm afraid that I've been guilty of that as well, because I can think of so many things that we do wrong and so many things that we could do right, and then the result, unfortunately, is the horse built by a committee that looks like a camel, lots of little patchwork things. So instead of a laundry list, I decided to create boundaries that I think everybody can agree on. Those boundaries are, first of all, accuracy. I hope we could all agree that grades ought to be accurate. That's certainly what we mean when we talk about accuracy in measuring anything. It ought to be the same in academic achievement. In other words, when 5 different teachers look at a particular performance, pretty often 4 out of 5 of them, or 5 out of 5, agree on what that performance really is, proficient or not. The second boundary is fairness. To the extent that there are differences among students, those differences are defined by differences in performance, not differences in gender, not differences in ethnicity, not differences in socioeconomic status. And there's a fair amount of evidence that says right now you can have 2 students with identical performance getting radically different grades based upon characteristics other than their performance. That violates the boundary of fairness. So we have accuracy, we have fairness. The third boundary is specificity. When we think of what grading really is, which is a form of feedback, then it's got to be specific enough to help students get better. In other words, you'd never see a music teacher or an athletic coach observe a student for 9 weeks and then at the end of that 9-week period say, your tackling or your volleyball shots are a C. They give feedback every day, all along the way, and the feedback is designed in such a specific way that it helps improve student performance. Grading ought to be the same. It ought to be specific enough that I know how to improve it. And fourth, it ought to be timely. 9 weeks is an eternity in the life of a student. We ought to be giving feedback all throughout the semester in the same way that music teachers and athletic coaches do. And remember, their feedback isn't designed just to accumulate data to provide an average score. Their feedback is designed to improve performance. As a result, just because you're giving feedback in a timely way doesn't mean that all that early feedback has to necessarily be averaged in to a final grade.
While researching this book, were there any findings that surprised you?
There really were, and one of the big ones is the gender imbalance in grading that is bad and getting worse. What is interesting to me is how the pendulum has swung in different directions, and let me illustrate. 20 years ago, there was a gender imbalance with boys outgrading girls in math and in science, and there was all kinds of speculation about brain differences and so on, and of course, a couple of enterprising researchers were able to find, well, wait a minute, if we use what is still very common but a terrible practice, and that is to call on students who raise their hand, the boys interested in science were raising their hands more than girls. We're getting called on about 5 times more frequently. As a result, we're getting feedback 5 times more frequently. As a result, we're getting more effective instruction. No wonder boys outgraded girls. But over the course of the last couple of decades, the pendulum swung. girls are more engaged in school than boys are, and girls are disproportionately rewarded for teacher-pleasing behaviors. And that includes not only showing up and getting work turned in, but participating in class. You hear the words "a pleasure to have in class" associated with girls far more than boys, and as a result, you see now a higher level of grades for girls. What surprised me, I think most casual observers have noticed that, what surprised me is the magnitude of the difference. For example, in the United States, the National Honor Society, which is a high school organization based exclusively on grades, they claim a little bit on character as well, but getting in the front door is all about grades. The ratio of females to males is 2 to 1. That is an extraordinary difference, way beyond what any sort of gender difference in performance might be. That suggests that grading is disproportionately influenced by gender. In individual schools, including where I happen to volunteer, the gender imbalance is 8 to 1 in the National Honor Society. Now, as most men who ever hope to get along with women will admit, yes, women may be smarter than we are, but they're not twice as smart. They're certainly not 8 times as smart. At some point, you have to recognize that the magnitude of those imbalances have more to do with grading systems that are focused on gender, not on performance. They don't really have to do with differences in performance.
What are some of the common arguments against reform, and how do you counter those arguments?
Well, there are 2 main arguments that you hear all the time. The first one is, if you give kids an extra opportunity to do their work, in other words, one kid gets it done on time, the second kid gets it done only by getting feedback, having a really tough, effective teacher who gives feedback and makes them do it over again, then it's not fair to the first kid who got it right the first time. Now, my counter to that is twofold. Number one, virtually everybody watching this video is in a standards-based or standards reference system in which we evaluate student performance not on a bell curve, not comparing one student to the other, but we compare them to a standard. And there is not a standard that says does algebra quickly. There's a standard that says does algebra accurately, does history deeply and thoughtfully, and so on. And it is crazy to assert that the first student who got something right the first time, perhaps because of excellent literacy in the home, or perhaps because parents checked or even did homework before, is morally superior to the second student who worked hard, got feedback, then improved his or her performance. Indeed, it is that cycle of working hard, respecting teacher feedback, improving performance that we ought to be encouraging. That second student should not be diminished, that ought to be applauded. The second common argument is that it just takes too much time. You know, to actually give kids feedback that improves their performance takes too much time. And the counter to that is, you know what really takes time is when kids fail, when you have to document suspensions because of poor discipline, which is directly associated with failure. And the argument in this book is that we can save teachers time by having effective feedback. I give several examples of that. We can certainly save teachers time by having fewer course failures, fewer instances of repetition, and fewer instances of class disruption and bad discipline. When you use effective feedback to improve student performance, it saves time, and it's better for the entire school. And frankly, the bottom line is, this isn't necessarily about what's popular. It's about what's right. Being accurate, fair, timely, and specific in grading. In other words, having effective grading practices won't always be right. Having lower failure rates won't always be right. Astonishingly, another bizarre finding was that when you have lower failure rates and you have more kids, therefore, eligible for advanced and honors classes, you'd think that those people would be applauded, but sometimes they run into a buzzsaw of complaints that now we have, quote, too many, unquote, kids taking advanced placement or honors classes. You know, frankly, that's a great complaint to have. But don't have any illusions that just because you do things that are accurate and fair, just because you do things that help students, means you're necessarily going to be the most popular person on campus. That's not going to happen.
What do you think is the most important message from Elements of Grading?
The most important message is this: grading is feedback. Everybody knows that feedback has to be accurate, fair, specific, and timely. Everybody knows that feedback, when it meets those criteria, is one of the most important links to student achievement. Indeed, John Hattie's evidence in the book Visible Learning suggests that effective feedback is even more impactful on student achievement than his socioeconomic status. And once we recognize that grading is a form of feedback, then we recognize that grading isn't just a matter of personal taste. It isn't just what I think it ought to be or what you think it ought to be, and after all, it all comes down to individual discretion. No, it's one of the most important things that we do to improve achievement, and it is a moral, ethical, and professional obligation for us to get it right.
Thank you for sharing your insights into elements of grading. Is there anything you would like to add or expand upon?
I would just do this, as I always do with my readers. Number one, to thank them, because I know that they get a lot of things across their desk, and they have to make choices about what to read. So I never take it for granted. Probably have 1 million books in print, and I appreciate every one of those readers who take time to engage with me, even if you disagree. And secondly, the reason that my email and website is in the book is that I invite that sort of dialogue with readers. I always learn from it, always happy to provide either webinars or conference calls with either study groups at university level or in school systems that are reading this. I know you can't personally engage with everybody at conferences and so on, so don't think for one moment that writers, and myself particularly, don't appreciate your willingness to reach out. I learn from it, and I hope you will too.
Thank you for your time today, Dr. Reeves.
My pleasure.